The great hall of the Silverfang Kingdom had never felt so cold. Elena Voss stood at its center, her hands bound loosely in front of her, her head bowed so low that her long brown hair covered most of her face. Around her, the pack had gathered in silence, their eyes fixed on her small, trembling figure. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne carved from ancient oak, sat Alpha King Draven Ashworth, his golden eyes sharp and unreadable. "Elena Voss," the guard captain announced, his voice echoing through the stone chamber. "You stand accused of treason against the Silverfang Kingdom. You are charged with leaking sacred information to the Blackthorn Pack, our sworn enemies. How do you answer these charges?" Elena's heart pounded so hard she feared everyone could hear it. She thought of her sister, Ivy, hiding somewhere in their small cottage at the edge of the territory, too frightened to face what she had done. Elena had made her choice the moment the guards arrived at their door. She would not let Ivy pay for this, not when their mother had died 3 years ago, leaving Elena as the only one left to protect her. "I confess," Elena said quietly, forcing the words out. "I am guilty." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some gasped. Others whispered that they had never suspected the quiet Voss girl, the one who spent her days helping in the healing house, tending to wounded warriors without complaint. Draven leaned forward slightly on his throne. He said nothing yet, but his eyes narrowed as he studied her. Something about the way she stood, shoulders tense, but her hands shaking not with anger or defiance, but with something closer to fear for someone else, did not sit right with him. "You confess so quickly," Draven said, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "Tell me, Elena Voss, what information did you leak? Be specific." Elena froze. She had not expected to be questioned so directly. She swallowed hard. The location of the sacred spring," she said, guessing, since that was the detail she had overheard the guards mention outside her home. "And how did you access the border patrol schedules that were also leaked?" Draven asked, his tone deceptively calm. Elena's mind went blank. She had no answer, because she truly did not know what had been leaked beyond the spring. Her silence stretched long enough that the entire hall seemed to hold its breath with her. I cannot say," she whispered. Draven studied her for a long moment. Then, instead of pronouncing the sentence everyone expected, exile, or worse, he raised a hand. "Take her to the castle chambers," he said, "not the dungeons. I wish to study this traitor more closely before I decide her fate." The hall erupted in confused whispers, but no one dared question the Alpha King. Guards stepped forward and led Elena away, her legs weak beneath her, her mind spinning with fear and disbelief. That night, Elena sat alone in a small stone room within the castle, far more comfortable than any dungeon cell, yet no less frightening. She did not understand why the king had spared her from immediate punishment. She only hoped that whatever he was planning, it would end with him losing interest in Ivy entirely. The next morning, a servant brought her simple food and told her the king wished to see her in the garden. Elena walked the quiet stone paths with 2 guards trailing behind her until she reached a small courtyard where Draven stood beside a row of blooming silver roses, flowers that only grew in this kingdom. "You do not eat like someone with nothing left to lose," Draven said without turning to look at her. "I do not understand, Your Majesty," Elena replied carefully. "Most who confess to treason either weep, beg for mercy, or grow bitter and cold," he said, finally turning to face her. "You have done none of these things. You simply wait, as though you are protecting something far more valuable than your own life." Elena's chest tightened. She kept her expression as still as she could manage. "I have nothing to protect, my lord. I have already confessed my crime." Draven studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes seeming to see straight through her carefully built walls. "Walk with me," he said instead of responding. Over the following days, Draven called for Elena often. Sometimes they walked along the fortress walls overlooking the vast forest territory. Other times they sat in the quiet library while he asked her seemingly casual questions about her life, her family, her sister. Elena answered carefully, always steering conversations away from Ivy, always trying to appear as guilty and resigned as possible, so the king would simply end this and let her fate be decided. But the more time she spent near him, the harder it became to keep her walls in place. Draven was not the cruel, distant ruler she had expected. He listened when she spoke. He noticed small things, the way she flinched when soldiers spoke of blackthorn wolves with hatred, the way her eyes softened when she passed injured warriors in the healing house, and immediately wanted to help them, even while under suspicion herself. One afternoon, as they stood on the fortress wall watching the sun begin to set over the pine forest, Draven spoke without warning. The border patrol schedules that were leaked were changed 3 times in the past month. Only someone with access to the War Council's private records could have known the most recent version. You have never once set foot in the War Council chambers. Elena's breath caught. She had not realized he had been quietly gathering proof against her confession the entire time. Perhaps I found another way, she said weakly. Elena, his voice was gentler than she expected. I do not believe you are the traitor. I believe you are protecting someone. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. You are wrong, my lord. I have already confessed. A confession built on guesses and silence is not a confession at all, Draven said. It is a sacrifice. Elena said nothing. She could not risk speaking, afraid that if she opened her mouth even slightly, the truth about Ivy would spill out and destroy everything she had tried to protect. That night, Draven called for his most trusted tracker, a quiet, sharp-eyed wolf named Corwin. He instructed him to watch the Voss cottage without being seen, to observe Ivy Voss and report anything unusual. Corwin left before dawn, disappearing into the forest shadows. Meanwhile, in the small cottage at the edge of the territory, Ivy paced back and forth across the wooden floor, her hands twisting together nervously. Days had passed since Elena's arrest, and no guards had come for her. She told herself this meant she was safe, that her sister's sacrifice had worked exactly as planned. Slowly, her fear began to fade, replaced by a dangerous mix of relief and greed. She had one more meeting scheduled with her Blackthorn contact, a silver-eyed wolf named Talon, who had promised her a new life outside the pack, away from the strict rules and constant watching eyes of Silverfang territory. He had told her that if she delivered one final piece of information, the location of the hidden weapons cache near the eastern ridge, he would help her escape before anyone discovered the truth. Believing herself safe, Ivy slipped out of the cottage that night and made her way through the trees toward the meeting point, unaware that Corwin was watching every step from the shadows above. He watched as Ivy handed Talon a folded parchment, watched as Talon pressed a small silver token into her palm as payment, watched as they spoke in low voices about the plan to smuggle her out of the territory within the week. Corwin memorized every detail, every word, and when the meeting ended, he followed Ivy just long enough to be certain of her identity before returning swiftly to the castle. By morning, Draven had everything he needed. He summoned both sisters to the Great Hall, though only Elena knew she had been called. She stood once again in the same spot where she had confessed days earlier, confused and frightened by the sudden urgency in the guards' voices. Moments later, Ivy was brought in as well, her face pale with shock at finding herself standing beside her sister before the entire court. "Elena!" Ivy whispered, horrified. "What is happening?" Elena reached for her sister's hand instinctively, still trying to protect her even now. "Stay calm," she murmured. "Let me handle this." Draven rose from his throne and descended the steps slowly, his presence commanding silence throughout the hall. "3 nights ago," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "Ivy Voss met with a blackthorn wolf named Talon in the forest near the eastern ridge. She delivered information regarding the location of our weapons cache in exchange for a promise of escape from this territory." Gasps filled the hall. Ivy's face drained of all color, her hand trembling in Elena's grip. "I have witnesses," Draven continued, nodding toward Corwin, who stepped forward with the silver token and the folded parchment recovered from the meeting site, along with a written account of everything he had witnessed. "I have evidence in her own handwriting, and I have proof that Elena Voss, the woman who confessed to this crime, could not possibly have accessed the information that was actually leaked." The hall fell into stunned silence. Every eye turned toward Ivy, who had begun to shake uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. "Ivy," Elena said softly, though her voice cracked with the weight of the moment, "tell them the truth, please." For a long moment, Ivy said nothing. Then, unable to bear the pressure of the silence, and the truth already laid bare before her, she broke down completely. "It's true," she sobbed. "All of it is true. I was scared, and Talon promised me a way out, a life away from all of this. And I believed him. When the guards came, I panicked. I let Elena take the blame, because I was too afraid to face what I had done." The court erupted into murmurs of shock and anger, but Draven raised a hand for silence once more. "Ivy Voss," he said, his voice heavy with judgment, "you are hereby sentenced to exile from Silverfang territory, effective immediately, in accordance with pack law regarding treason." Ivy collapsed to her knees, weeping, but no one moved to comfort her. Elena stood frozen, torn between relief that the truth had finally surfaced and grief for the sister she was now losing, regardless of the sacrifice she had made to try to save her. Draven turned to Elena next, and his expression softened into something gentler than the hall had ever seen from their king. "Elena Voss," he said, loud enough for the entire court to hear, "you stand accused of nothing. You did not commit treason. You committed an act of love, however misguided, in trying to protect your sister from the consequences of her own choices. This court owes you an apology, not a punishment." Elena felt her knees weaken with relief, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, as the weight of the past several days lifted from her shoulders. The crowd, once suspicious and cold toward her, now watched with quiet admiration, understanding the depth of what she had been willing to sacrifice. As the guards led Ivy away to prepare for her exile, Elena remained standing alone in the center of the hall, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Draven approached her slowly, his golden eyes filled with something she had not seen from him before. Not the judgment of a king, but the quiet respect of someone who had watched her carefully and come to understand exactly who she was. "I suspected your innocence almost from the beginning," he admitted quietly, for her ears alone. "But suspicion is not proof, and I needed something strong enough to protect you from a court eager for someone to blame." "Thank you," Elena whispered, "for not giving up until you found the truth." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, Draven found Elena standing alone on the fortress wall, staring out at the forest that stretched endlessly beyond the kingdom's borders. He joined her quietly, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence beside her. "You do not have to return to an empty cottage," he said gently. "You could remain here, under my protection, if you wish it." Elena turned to look at him, surprised by the offer, and by the sincerity behind it. "Why would you offer me such a thing?" "Because loyalty like yours is rare," Draven said simply. "The kind that sacrifices everything and asks for nothing in return. And I find myself wanting to protect someone who has spent her whole life protecting others, without anyone protecting her in return." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. For the first time since the guards had arrived at her door days ago, she let herself imagine a future built not on sacrifice and fear, but on truth, understanding, and perhaps something more. She looked out at the darkening forest one last time, then turned back toward the castle, toward the king who had refused to let an innocent woman fall, and toward whatever came next. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like that very much." And as the last light of the sun faded behind the mountains, Elena Voss finally allowed herself to hope again,